On today's show, what are the possible changes head coach Ime Udoka might make to the Houston Rockets starting lineup post All-Star break? Is Jalen Green's starting spot the only starting spot in danger, or could somebody else also see some time on the bench? We're going to go through the pros and cons of Amen Thompson, Cam Whitmore, and Tari Eason taking one of the Rockets' 5 starting spots. It's all coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start.
Throw it up to Jalen Green.
Sengun here in the short row. Oh, my, that's the no-look.
Jabari for 3 and the win. Yeah!
Look at Tari Eason.
Here comes Tari.
No!
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal.
The Houston Rockets select Amen Thompson and Cam Whitmore.
One thing I have never done is not made the playoffs, and so we want to take that step here as well.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Mondays. Be sure to follow along on Twitter at JT Gatlin, and the show, of course, at Locked On Rockets, free and available wherever you listen to your podcasts, including YouTube. And as always, thank you so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you for being an everydayer and making the show part of your day every single day. Joining us now is none other than your weekly co-host, the X's and O's man himself, Alykhan Bijani, who you can track down on Twitter at Rockets_insider. Here to tackle what could be a new revamped looking Houston Rockets team once we get back from the All-Star break. We had Ime Udoka's post-game quote after the ugly loss to Alykhan's Memphis Grizzlies, depleted Memphis Grizzlies, I should say. And Ime talking about potentially needing to make a change to the Rockets starting lineup. So let's go ahead and we're going to run that back. We talked about it in our last episode, the recap of that Grizzlies loss. Well, let's go ahead and revisit that quote right here from the jump. And we'll do the entire quote this time, where Ime Udoka, when asked about Houston's lack of energy, responded, "It's definitely a concerning problem. Maybe I have to look at the rotation and the lineup I have out there starting and try to get 5 competitors out there at one time to avoid poor starts like that. I will look at all of that over the break, look in the mirror at myself, and figure out the best way forward to get us off to better starts." Alykhan, right out of the gate, how are you feeling about this Ime Udoka kind of addressing the slow starts like this by basically saying, yeah, I might have to change up the starting lineup?
Absolutely. Jackson, it's inexcusable that on the road you have this many poor starts. It's inexcusable that you start playing in the second half and you start competing whenever you're trying to come back into a game. The Rockets don't need to be the best three-point shooting team in the league. Don't have to be a really good shooting team. If they let their defense create for their offense and let their effort kind of dictate their play, they should have at least 5-10 more wins than they do right now. And it is absolutely inexcusable at the lack of effort that we see at the start of games. You let Memphis, a team that was struggling offensively, have one of their best games offensively of the season against you. You're supposed to be a team that's one of the best defensive teams in the league. And I think Ime's right. There needs to be a change. And it's not change for the sake of making a change. It's change for the sake of accountability. We can see in the starting lineup, and it's not just one player, 2 players, it's pretty much everybody in the starting lineup, who, except for Fred VanVleet when healthy, who is most of the time not competing. There are lapses. And ultimately, if you want to win games and you want to send a message that this is how we're going to play, you can't have those lapses.
Fully agree with you there. And I do think, honestly, a change to the starting lineup is probably long overdue. I think there was a level of the Rockets wanted to stay committed to their starting 5, yes. Fred, Jalen, Dillon, Jabari, and Sengun. And I think the elephant in the room here is that the obvious candidate, unfortunately, to swap out in the starting 5 to make some kind of meaningful change to that starting 5-man group is Jalen Green, because he's the one of the starting 5 so far this season that has largely underperformed relative to his expectations. But my question for you, Alykhan, is Is there anybody else in that Rockets starting five that you think could potentially warrant a shakeup, either because they just haven't been playing well as of late, or maybe you think their role would be better served coming off the bench, or just, again, maybe one of the other possible candidates here that we're going to be talking about, whether it's Amen Thompson, Cam Whitmore, Tari Eason, health permitting, one of these other guys would potentially just be a better fit in the starting lineup over any of these other guys besides just Jalen Green?
I think it's a complicated question, and I think three people who I have as candidates right now are Jalen, Dillon Brooks, and Jabari Smith Jr. And I'm not putting Alperen and Sengun there, even though honestly there are times where Alp has defensive lapses, and he should be playing better defensively. And the only reason I'm not including Alp in this list is because there is nobody else behind him besides Jeff Green who can start for him. And also, Alp is right now clearly one of your your best offensive player. And you still need to be able to have his ability to create and do things. But Alp is not lacking a fault as well in terms of the defensive miscues. But if we're focusing on,
and I want to highlight, it's also not just defensive miscues. It's across. It's the energy, it's the effort, it's the right being locked in, right, making silly mistakes on the offensive end. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Thank you for correcting me. And for Jalen, it's you have to be good at something when you're struggling offensively. Whether it's good at rebounding, whether it's good at things. I mean, he's had a good stretch recently, but whenever you're not playing well offensively, you have to hang your hat on something. And what is that for him right now? Whenever he's struggling, I think it's like the competitive nature. Like, what is he going to compete on if his shot is struggling? Dillon Brooks, if you're going to get beat by defensively, you have to make sure offensively you're letting the ball come to you and you do things. Yeah, attack mismatches. Yeah, get your pull-up threes. We know you can hit those from the top of the key, but you have to be able to limit some of those shots, right? Jabari Smith Jr. having a heck of a season. These last 10 or so games, he's been struggling shooting the basketball.
He has not been the same since returning from injury, unfortunately. His numbers are down across the board since coming back from injury. His rebounding numbers have taken a significant hit since coming back from that injury. I don't know if it's because he's maybe playing through possibly a little bit of pain still or some discomfort, so that could be a factor. Or maybe it's even potentially a factor, right? Maybe he just doesn't trust that ankle the same way, right, since coming back. There's variables at play here, absolutely. But he's definitely another candidate where you could look at it and you can make a very strong argument. Hey, maybe Tari over Jabari or something at that 4 spot, quite possibly.
I have a question for you, Jackson, and I haven't mentioned it because I don't think he should come off the bench, but is Fred a candidate to come off the bench to you?
I think the only way that Fred VanVleet is a candidate to come off the bench is if the Rockets really wanted to shift kind of their goal, their mentality for this back 1/3 of the season, whatever, into seeing which combinations of the young guys really work well together and getting a really good look at, say, like a starting backcourt of maybe Amen and Cam. If they're really all in on those two guys and excited about their future, then you want to see 25, 30 games of those two guys playing heavy minutes with each other in the starting lineup, then possibly yes. And I don't think I think Fred is a mature enough adult that he can understand, hey, okay, the season's maybe a little bit lost. We don't have a shot at making the play-in tournament anymore. They're going to rest and kind of conserve me a little bit so that I don't, have an injury here at the tail end of the season that's already kind of lost. I think Fred's an adult enough to understand if they want to do that. I don't think that they will, because here's the way that we saw Ime kind of bench Jalen Green there against the Grizzlies. I think it tells me Ime still wants to gun for that final play-in spot. Even if it's potentially a little out of reach at this point for the Rockets, I think Ime's goal is make the play-in, not at all costs, but get there. Like, I think that's what he wants out of this final 1/3 of the season, is to make a good faith effort push to be in the play-in discussion. I don't think you get there by benching Fred VanVleet.
It's going to be interesting to see. I think even more importantly than making the play-in is you want to play for something right now, right? Even if they are close to playing for the play-in, this will give us the data that we are looking at in terms of figuring out which of these young players are successful when paired together.
Absolutely. And that's something that we're going to kind of discuss here coming up in these next couple segments, is which players make the most sense to potentially inject into the Houston Rockets starting lineup. We're going to go through some of the pros and cons of Amen Thompson, Cam Whitmore, and Tari Eason. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Basketball host Josh Lloyd to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each and every week all season long. Whether you're prepping for a daily draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you with players that are guaranteed to fit on your roster. So let's see who Josh has picked out for us on this week's eBay Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. The first name, a name that some Rockets fans should be pretty familiar with, the twin of Amen Thompson, Ausar Thompson with the Detroit Pistons. The Pistons have overhauled their roster, and hopefully that means that Monty Williams will bump Ausar back into a larger role in the rotation. The next name to be on the lookout for, Bennedict Mathurin with the Indiana Pacers. Buddy Hield shipped off to the Philadelphia 76ers, so that should mean more minutes and more of an opportunity for Bennedict Mathurin within the Pacers rotation. So definitely a couple names you want to keep your eyes on. Now, Josh Lloyd from Locked On Fantasy Basketball is going to help you win your fantasy championship, and eBay Motors knows that a championship team is about each player being a perfect fit, the same as with your vehicle. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof rack, bumpers, whatever your car needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. eBay Guaranteed Fit, available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now, Alykhan, you brought up a really good point there in the first segment when we were first talking about Alperen Sengun, right? There's not a guy behind Alp who can do what he does on this roster. There's just not. And I think the same argument applies for Fred VanVleet as well. So when you asked me about, could Fred be a candidate to come off the bench? I think if the Rockets' goals are drastically different in the final one-third of the season, and they just really want to experiment and see what they have with some of the young guys and different permutations of backcourt matchups, whether it's Amen and Jalen or Amen and Cam or Cam and Jalen, then fine. Give Fred a smaller role, bring him off the bench, conserve him, put him in bubble wrap so that he's not hurt going into the offseason and keep him healthy. That's fine. But nobody else on this roster provides what Fred does. Nobody can run the offense the way he does. Nobody else is a floor general on this team. Even though Amen has shown some serious flashes of playmaking ability, he's also not quite the half-court offensive floor general that Fred VanVleet is, getting the Rockets into their sets, delivering the ball to Alperen Sengun in the pick and roll, all these different things. So with that said, I think that you have to look at, when you're looking at potentially replacing the one guy that we talked about already, Jalen Green, you brought up that point as well of, what else are you bringing to the table, right? What else can you provide? And I think that's the issue. And I made this argument, I think like 2 months ago, but if Jalen's not scoring the ball, even though he's improved as a playmaker, he's making better reads, even though he's improved as a defender, even though he's improved as a rebounder as of late, finding ways to get the defensive board and just take off and get out in transition to ignite his own offense, to ignite the team in transition. That's all great. That's all well and good. But there are other players on this roster who provide other things, even when they aren't scoring the basketball. And I think that's where you get into that argument of, okay, if Jalen's not scoring, and even if he's not scoring at an elite level or an efficient level, whatever, what else is he providing you? And I think you get into the argument where Amen is giving you a lot more than Jalen can give you. If you take scoring out of the equation for all these names, Amen, even if you take scoring out of the equation for Cam, I think Cam probably has Jalen beat just as like a man-to-man individual defender. Jalen's clearly the better playmaker right now. And then Tari, another elite defender, right? So there's a lot to kind of consider here. Which name do you want to talk about first as far as a potentially being inserted into the starting lineup and what it would look like and getting into some of the pros and cons?
Yeah, I'd like to start at Amen, Jackson, if that's okay. And I think if Amen would be inserted into the starting lineup, you put him into Jalen's role. And I think it does a few things for you. And it just a couple things that Ime Udoka has talked about over the course of the season make sense for him. It makes sense for that to happen. First is you have Amen who's able to play off of Sengun and play off of Fred VanVleet and has an ability to roam the dunker spot and also cut off the wing if needed.
Do you think I'm curious on that note, do you think Amen already in his short amount of time, I think he's already got the best chemistry with Sengun at playing off of Sengun, not like him setting up Sengun, because Fred and Sengun have a great little two-man game with each other. But I think of players who play well off of Sengun, I think Amen is already the best one on the roster. He really understands how to cut and how to operate playing off of Sengun better than I think anybody else on this roster does at this point.
Well, I also think that it has to do with the fact that the cutting ability is there and that he's able to finish around the rim, right? I think, in my opinion, Fred VanVleet would be that guy if he shot a better percentage around the rim, because him and LP would work well together, right? But I see your point, and I think right now, there's a really good argument you can make that him and Sengun have the best chemistry, and that's a big reason why he would be a part of that offensively. What the Rockets have been doing with him in the dunker spot is essentially when Sengun is at the middle of the floor, right? Because that's where he can see a double team easy, a lot easier than if he's at the baseline. Even if he's at the baseline, Amen is essentially like shifting back and forth, coming into the paint, getting out of the paint, kind of helping Alp see where is the second defender coming from. And that's big because then Alp can much easier anticipate where that second defender is coming from and where that passing lane will open. It may not even have to be to Amen, but if Amen cuts in or dives in a little bit and he's able to bring in a second defender and Alp notices, oh, hey, it's probably coming from the wing, passing lane is open. So those passing lanes is a big deal for me when I look at Amen. And then lastly, from an offensive side, transition. He's pushing the pace. He's doing a lot of things where he's touching the paint and getting others involved. Rebound, he gets the rebound. He's a walking double-double at that point. Gets the rebound, attacks, touches the paint, always touches the paint, then passes it back out. He's been great there. And then defensively for me, he's one of the better defenders on this team, absolutely at this point. And for me, whenever he's playing in a switching scheme, he's excelling. And what that can do for you is that it allows you to switch a lot more of your actions with your starting lineup. Obviously, with Alp, you want to keep him away from the perimeter. And not to say Alp hasn't done a good job on the perimeter. He's been great on hedging and showing. But you still want him to not have to switch onto a perimeter player possession after possession. Amen can allow you to do that a little more with Fred and with Jabari and Dillon if that's the only starting lineup change that's made. So for those reasons, I think Amen makes a lot of sense. And in terms of competitiveness and being an extra ball handler that Ime Udoka constantly talks about that he wants, he checks all the boxes.
I love a lot of the points that you just made. And I think that just starting with the defensive side of things, right? Having another defender out there that I think, one, you would suddenly be a lot bigger just at that position on the floor, because right now the Rockets are undersized at 4 out of their 5 positions in the starting lineup. You can maybe make an argument that Dillon Brooks is like average sized for a wing in today's NBA, but I really think realistically they're undersized at 4 of their 5 spots. Jabari is the only guy who isn't undersized at his position. So if you add Amen Thompson to the starting lineup in place of Jalen Green, then suddenly you have 2 kind of jumbo wings at their respective slots. It gives you another switchable defender. I love watching the way that Amen fights over screens and uses his length to recover, getting back into the play and stuff. So I think that does kind of help Sengun as well. Just, having another really adept wing defender out there on the court with him kind of takes away some of the onus that gets placed on him when he is, maybe guarding a pick and roll where it's him and Jalen are the 2 defenders guarding a pick and roll. They've improved as defenders this year, but they are still 2 of the weaker defenders on the Rockets roster. So they can be kind of exposed at times defensively, especially when a defense is targeting both of them simultaneously. And this is your point about what he provides offensively. I think it makes a ton of sense because we've seen throughout this year already, specifically, we've seen Fred VanVleet take less of a role or less of an on-ball role when Ime Udoka has been very clearly trying to get Jalen Green going, whether it's at the beginning of games or maybe the start of a third quarter, where the first 3, 4, 5 plays are all run with Jalen Green having the ball in his hands, where he's running the offense, or even late in games when we've seen Ime Udoka trust Jalen Green to be the primary facilitator and run the show late in a game. Fred VanVleet is very capable of playing off ball. And in fact, I do think that's a way to kind of, I don't want to say preserve Fred, but use him as a weapon in a different way, right? Because when he's initiating the offense and he's running the show and everything, that's great. And he's really good at that. And his assist to turnover ratio is incredible. He takes great care of the basketball. He shares the ball well. He makes sure to, feed the hot hand. He does everything you would want and then some out of your starting point guard. But allowing him to be a play finisher instead of a play starter, I think unlocks a little bit more of Fred's scoring capabilities and kind of helps address the fact that this team really doesn't have a lot of shooting. When one of your best shooters has to be the guy who's constantly initiating offense, then it takes away his ability to actually use his shooting as a weapon. Whereas if you started Amen Thompson, gave him more of the on-ball reps with the starting unit, then you can have Amen and Sengun as your primary creators, and then you have three pretty high quality shooters around them in Fred VanVleet, Dillon Brooks, who's still been shooting lights out even after his 2 of 10 performance against the Grizzlies, and Jabari Smith Jr., who's trending downward, unfortunately, with his shooting as of late, but on the season, he's still hovering around 37-ish%, so that's still really respectable, and I'm confident that Jabari can keep those numbers up. So I really like it. I think it's probably, I think there's an argument to be made it's maybe the cleanest fit, cleanest switch between the potential candidates here to take over that starting spot for Jalen Green. So
I do like your point, in regards to Amen, that he opens up Fred a lot more to do different things. We've talked about on the show just together, when Fred rests or he plays fewer minutes, his percentage from 3 goes up, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's just a fact, right? That, if you do that and allow Fred to potentially rest a little more, you don't even just play as much, but just rest a little more and give Amen more of those reins with the second unit, you can allow him to do those things.
And I will say one of the other things that we didn't, we're very high on Amen Thompson. Clearly, we both really enjoy watching him. Watching him has been one of the best developments of this season. But I do think there are some drawbacks that come with potentially inserting Amen Thompson into the starting lineup. And one of the big ones here is you are then giving yourself it's a very clear lack of shooting within that starting lineup, because you go from the Rockets starting lineup that they've used the majority of the season. Even though Jalen Green isn't shooting the ball well, defenses still treat him as a shooter from the perimeter. They still close out hard on him. They run him off the 3-point line. They treat him as a 3-point shooting threat. Whether they should or not is completely besides the point. Amen Thompson is not. On the scouting report says give him all the space in the world. Back up. He's not going to
6 of 38. 6 of 38 this season from 3. Yeah.
Yeah. So wait, Amen Thompson is 6 of 38?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Amen Thompson has the same shooting percentage on the season that Jalen Green does for the entire month of February. That's funny. Sorry. So, because I put those numbers out on after digging into why the Rockets shooting was so bad in February. Sorry, you said 6 of 38, and I was like, wait, are we talking about Jalen again? It messed me up. Anyways, no, but right. So it becomes. It's not that two non-shooters can't work. They absolutely can work together, especially when they have the court vision, the playmaking ability that Amen Thompson and Alperen Sengun do possess. But it also really means that the other 3 guys that are your shooters on the floor along those 2 non-shooters really have to be on their P's and Q's, because if you have an off game where 1 or 2 or more of those guys are struggling from 3, it's going to look just as ugly as it did against the Grizzlies offensively, where Jabari went 0 of 6, Jalen went 0 of 4, Dillon was 2 of 10, and Amen and Sengun aren't shooting threes anyways. So I think that's the one danger zone you get into with Amen is you have a clear and distinct lack of shooting in that starting lineup if you insert him there.
And one thing that Ime Udoka has done, and I want Rockets fans to pay attention to this, they're using Amen very few possessions. I think that'll ramp up post All-Star break that Amen has reps doing this, but they're using him as a screener. And I think if he does start, you'll see a lot more of that, of him being a screener for Alperen Sengun. Similar to some stuff that Fred VanVleet has in this offense, that'll run an inverted pick and roll. I think you'll see that. And then also I think you'll see Amen and Fred VanVleet running a lot more 1-2 kind of pick and roll, similar to what Jalen and Fred have done and Jalen and Cam have done over the last few weeks. So I do think those are some other extra ways to kind of sprinkle in Amen's involvement on the ball and to keep the defense from just playing off completely. And ultimately, my biggest fear with Amen is the free throw shooting. We know he's going to get to the paint. We know he's going to be able to go up there. He has to shoot a better percentage from the free throw line.
And this one almost goes without saying, but he's a rookie. Rookie mistakes are going to be a part of the package, whether it's Amen, if it's Cam Whitmore, those guys are going to have rookie mistakes. But the silver lining to those rookie mistakes is I think both of them have shown an ability to, when they do make those mistakes, they're very coachable. They understand and they recognize those mistakes, and they're able to kind of iron them out even within the given flow of a game, right? Maybe, they make a mistake early in the first quarter and then you don't see them make that same mistake for the next 3 quarters because Ime Udoka is very active coaching on the sidelines, always pulling these guys aside and saying, hey, don't do this, or hey, do more of this. This is working. So that's at least something to consider here. But we got two more names for your consideration. Cam Whitmore and Tari Eason, who would make sense to inject into the Houston Rockets starting lineup. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Robinhood. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from another retirement account with 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most of your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024 validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% match on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC member SIPC is a registered broker-dealer. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now, Alykhan, the next name here that I want us to talk about is Cam Whitmore. And I think for Cam, the argument for Cam makes a lot of sense for a variety of reasons. One, because as soon as he stepped onto the scene and started getting minutes for this Rockets team, we saw immediately he is a true blue, like bona fide alpha scorer. He is a guy that if there's one thing Cam Whitmore knows how to do, it is put the ball in the basket. I think he's clearly right now the Rockets' best catch and shoot threat on the entire roster. He is not afraid to pull the trigger on a shot. There is not a single shot that Cam Whitmore has taken that he didn't like. So, however, I think that the argument that we were making there in segment 2, right, for Amen Thompson starting, I think that would change kind of a lot of the fabric, the identity of this team, right? Where suddenly Fred is playing a significantly larger role off the ball. It changes a lot of your approach offensively. It puts a lot more of the onus on the shooters that are around Amen and Sengun. Whereas if you were to swap Jalen for Cam Whitmore, and Cam Whitmore was the player that you insert into the starting lineup, I think it allows you to more so double down on the identity of what this team probably should have been and could have been earlier on had Jalen's outside shooting not struggled as much as it did this season, because then you've got your bread and butter, which is obviously running your offense through a heavy dose of Alperen, Sengun, and Fred VanVleet, a lot of Alperen, Sengun post-up opportunities, and you're surrounding Alp with 4 bona fide shooters who at that point, then, at least, on paper, it would work really, really well with those 4 players, Fred, Cam, Dillon, and Jabari, playing off of Alperen, Sengun. But it also kind of requires this team and this coaching staff to really lean all the way in to Sengun as a primary facilitator, which we've seen them do sometimes this season, because you're also limiting yourself at that point because Cam is not a playmaker. He's not a dynamic wing scorer, or he's not a dynamic wing creator the way that Jalen at least theoretically is and can be, on a game-by-game basis, can help kind of with some of the playmaking duties, can run some of the offense and let Fred play off ball. Cam is not that guy. You're not going to give the ball to Cam and let him run the offense. So everything kind of has to be run through some combination of Fred or Alp at that point, if that's the change you make to the starting lineup.
I think those are some fantastic points you're making. I think another thing with Cam is that he allows you to play quicker in transition. Any change we're talking about here, we've mentioned Amen, we've mentioned Cam, and we're gonna talk about Tari. What is the skill of all? What is the strength of all 3 of them when they come off the bench? They push the pace. They play in transition, right? And if we're talking about Cam, especially, Cam will push. Cam will take a shot early on, and that's going to be interesting for me to see. Is who is Ime looking to replace, and potentially with whichever player they do replace him, that player with. It's going to really change the way they push in transition, right? Because like you said, no matter who they bring in, even if it's Fred, it stays with Jalen, or if it's a Dillon or whatever happens, you're going to see the pace being pushed a lot more. And that's still going to change the fabric of the offense with Fred VanVleet, because ultimately with Fred, they've been one of the slowest, if not the slowest offense in the NBA. And so I do think it's also interesting to consider how that plays with the pace and what happens there. But it just in regards to Cam, I don't know if I'd want him to start. I think he just brings you so much juice coming off the bench that you need. And you want to have an identity of competitiveness. Not saying Cam doesn't give you that. Absolutely not. I think just Amen fits that mold better. And if we're looking at Jalen, if Amen is the one replacing Jalen, Jalen and Cam have played really well together as a duo. And I do wonder if offensively, when Alperen Sengun sits and you have Jalen and Cam together playing, brings two guys who, on paper, can beat their man off the dribble and do specific things. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about Cam in this case. I think Cam is an option, but I do think he's still better suited to come off the bench and pair him alongside some of your starters.
And a couple of the other drawbacks when it comes to Cam Whitmore, similar to Amen Thompson, you're going to be, you're going to deal with some rookie mistakes potentially out of him. I think there's maybe a little bit of a lack or just the learning curve there of some of the defensive awareness, right? Where when Cam is playing on ball, when he's, matched up, one-on-one and defending like that, he's fine. Like he's a brick wall. He does a great job staying in front of his defender. It's when Cam is playing when he's away from the play, when he's having to focus on the off-ball movements and switching and all those little things that happen away from the ball, that's where I think I fall into a little bit of a concern with Cam. Is he locked in? Is he fully engaged defensively at all times, the way that you need to be with a team that switches so many of their actions, whether it's on ball, off ball, the way the Rockets defense does function. So that is at least a little bit of a concern there. And I agree with your point about keeping kind of that scoring punch off the bench, because even though Cam would work almost seamlessly as just a plug and play and catch and shoot threat off of the actions initiated by Fred and Alp, you then lose a huge chunk of your scoring punch off the bench unless Jalen is somehow going to replace that scoring punch. But we've seen Jalen, be kind of inconsistent and up and down all season. So I don't think you can exclusively rely on, hey, okay, we're going to put Cam in the starting lineup and Jalen is going to be our guaranteed scoring punch off the bench. I don't think you can do that quite just yet. So I agree with those points there. And I do think, right, you talked about this when we were talking about Amen, that lack of playmaking does become a bit of an issue, right? You suddenly only have one primary ball handler in Fred VanVleet. Dillon can handle the ball a little bit on the perimeter, but he's not somebody you want with a ton of reps running, You
want him doing mismatches. You don't want him running your offense.
Exactly, right? You don't want him initiating plays or sets or anything like that. Fred is basically the only guy that can do that on the floor if you had the three of Cam, Dillon, and Jabari. And that's actually also a concern that you would have even if you injected Tari Eason into the starting lineup, because then you're essentially running a primary ball handler, a lead guard in Fred. You're running three wings in Dillon, Tari, and Jabari, and then you're running Sengun. So it kind of has some of the same stylistic properties as running Cam Whitmore. You just become a lot more defensive oriented with Tari Eason in place of Cam. But offensively, it's still kind of the same concept where you have three guys who are all catch and shoot threats, who are switchable, who all these different things. But, does Tari fit the bill? Because similar to your point about Cam, I made this argument a long time ago, and I'm curious because I don't have anything to support this. This is just purely like feel and speculation. But I think part of the reason Tari is so impactful in the minutes that he plays is something about that level of like chaotic energy that he brings to a game is really beneficial having off the bench. And I don't know if his play style is as conducive in a starting unit as it would be coming off the bench. And it's so weird, and I feel like some people are going to try and dunk on me for making this comp. Do you remember when David Nwaba played for the Rockets? David Nwaba, when he came off the bench, was such an impact player off the bench. Like, he was an incredible role player off the bench. And then you threw him into the starting lineup, and it was like a nightmare. And part of that was the spacing and the lack of shooting and some of those other issues. But and Tari doesn't come with those issues, right? Tari is not a bad floor spacer. He's shooting a respectable percentage from three, all that stuff. But something about that chaotic level of energy that David Nwaba and Tari Eason both kind of provide to a game when they come off the bench, I just don't know if it translates as well to the starting lineup. That's my argument.
Well, a couple of years ago, I was talking to a coach, and they had talked about how when you're a starter, you play with your starters. You ideally kind of play lockstep, like it's like a string. You play with each other, and when you're a bench player and you're truly in an impactful bench player, that's because you're able to break that string for the opposing team. And I think for me, Tari is that example. when Tari comes in off the bench, that's when both teams are playing with spot minutes from their starters, bench, but it's all mixed together, right? For about a 12-minute period, and between the first and second quarters, and between the third and fourth quarters, that 12-minute period in between is a lot of guys coming in and out. And that's when Tari can make his impact because he doesn't need a play run for him. And his job is to break up possessions and break up rhythm. And I wonder if what you're saying, I wonder if how true could that be? I still think though that, you know, he is somebody who I'd like to give a shot because you need somebody, and we've seen this from Amen these last few games, who needs to gamble defensively, who needs to disrupt defensively. You need to bring somebody in who can kind of force the offense to have to hold it a second or two because they're anticipating the other defender anticipating, right? And so it's just keeping them on their toes, keeping them off balance. Tari would provide that. And also in a starting lineup with Dillon Brooks and Jalen Green and Fred VanVleet and Alperen Sengun, all four guys who like to get their own shots and create. Tari doesn't need a shot for himself. He'll play off of that. One thing on Dillon Brooks I want to mention, because this could be a potential person, right, for Dillon Brooks or for Jabari Smith Jr. if Tari were to start. The last few games that Fred VanVleet has not played, Dillon Brooks only has 1 assist per game. When Fred VanVleet was playing, he had about 3 or 4 assists per game. Why is that important? Because when Fred's not playing, Dillon is taking on more of that onus that I have to create shots. Not create shots necessarily for others, but create shots for himself because he knows he can get himself going. Not in a bad way. You have to play within the flow of the offense.
No, it's a little bit in a bad way. It's okay. He's reverting a little bit to Memphis Dillon.
The Memphis game, I have nothing to say about the Memphis game. But ultimately, like what I'm trying to say is the more creators you have in the starting lineup, the better. And that is why all these examples you've shared with me, right? All these players we've talked about, the Amen one makes the most sense because even if you take away a shot creator in Jalen Green, you would still be adding a shot creator. Dillon and Jabari ultimately are your shooters. You don't want to bring in a shooter who's like, if you bring in Cam or Tari, you want to make sure that the drop-off isn't drastic in terms of your shooting ability. I think one player we haven't talked about who I think is a legitimate option to start, especially with a recent stretch, is Aaron Holiday. I think Aaron Holiday is a legitimate threat to be a starter post-All-Star break, considering the shooting and off the ball and the ability to be a lead guard in certain situations. Just wanted to put that out there.
And look, and shout out to Aaron Holiday, who has far exceeded any level of expectations that I had for him as a vet minimum signed third string point guard. He has been sensational this season. I think some Rockets fans have been unfairly critical of him when he doesn't have these, monster performances off the bench because, again, he was supposed to be your third string injury insurance point guard, and he's really stepped up in a big way early on with the Amen Thompson injury and even now filling a void with Fred VanVleet. He's had these insane posters. He's been playing out of his freaking mind. So yeah. I agree with your point about it. I don't think Aaron makes a ton of sense, if only because I feel like starting a backcourt that is of 2 6-foot tall guards.
I agree.
You are at that point ridiculously small. I know you can get away with it for certain stretches of a game because Fred and Aaron both play a lot bigger than their listed heights. They're better defenders than all of that. But I just don't think it makes sense from a starting point. And also, it's also important, I think, to keep that shooting coming off the bench, right? If Aaron's going to stay in that role, similar to the Cam Whitmore argument, I think you got to space out that shooting. I think we're both in agreement here, though. I think the clear candidate that makes the most sense to be inserted into the starting lineup is more than likely Amen Thompson, for all the reasons that we've highlighted in this episode, for what he brings to the table from a defensive perspective, the rebounding that he brings, the fact that there's not going to be a drop-off from a playmaking perspective. In fact, you can make an argument that there's actually an uptick in a playmaking capacity with Amen Thompson over Jalen Green. Yes, you do lose some of the potential outside shooting, but then that also gets offset by playing Fred VanVleet in more of an off-ball role next to Amen Thompson in the starting lineup. It's all about whether or not Ime Udoka thinks that's the right pathway forward for this team to remain competitive and to, again, get the most out of this group of guys. And again, potentially putting Jalen Green into that sixth man role off the bench and giving him a change of scenery and being able to approach and attack the game in a different way. You brought up the string comment, right? If the 5 starters all playing on a string attached together, if Jalen's coming off the bench, he doesn't have to worry about that string. He doesn't have to worry about fitting in with the rest of the 5 starters. He can just come in and do his thing. He can check in and just try to take over the game, try to score. And if it's not there that night, then cool. Ime can go to a different player. He can reduce his minutes, whatever. But if he is on one, if he's locked in that game, if he can't miss, if he's unguardable, then cool. You ride that hot hand and he can win you a game or two by himself probably. So I do want to hear from our listeners, though. If you're listening to this, if you're watching on YouTube, I want your thoughts. I know I already asked this question last episode when we first kind of presented Ime Udoka's post-game commentary, but we spent the entirety of this episode kind of presenting evidence and numbers and all this as to why some of these changes would make sense, what changes we would ultimately like to see. So I want your thoughts. Which starting lineup would you like to see post All-Star break from this Houston Rockets team? What change would you like to see Ime Udoka make? Let us know in the YouTube comments. But Alykhan, you know the drill. Let everybody know where they can track you down at. You can follow me on Twitter, Rockets_Insider, and we'll see you next week. That's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Rockets. As always, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.